Alright, 10 albums to check out if you love Deftones. Thanks for watching. If you enjoy some of these albums, please like, subscribe, all that really helps. Appreciate you. Alright, number 1, Hum, You'd Prefer an Astronaut, an album that has a major influence on 2010's alternative music, and Hum in general, a band that was sort of underappreciated in their day. But this album still got some radio play. I mean, Howard Stern was a huge fan of the single Stars, gave it some airplay, and it was definitely respected in its time, and Deftones took a lot of influence from this album. You can definitely hear from Adrenaline to Around the Fur how Deftones started to kind of widen their soundscape, incorporate some of the shoegaze elements that they become known for, but particularly on Around the Fur, I think Deftones really incorporated that kind of alternative metal sound that Hum did so well, and you can really hear their influence. So, incredible album. I think Deftone fans will love the hypnotic riffs and the really awesome shoegaze soundscapes on here. Really classic 90s album. Alright, number 2, PJ Harvey, her debut album Dry, which came out in 1992. Classic 90s album, very influential, particularly influential to Chino. You can hear PJ's influence on Chino's vocal melodies on both Adrenaline and Around the Fur, particularly on songs like Mascara. If you listen to Fountain off of PJ Harvey's Dry, I think you can hear how Chino really drew a ton of inspiration from PJ's vocals. Mascara is eerily similar. Incredible album. Anybody who likes 90s guitar-driven music will find a lot to love in PJ Harvey's music, and Dry is a great place to start. You could also listen to Rid of Me as well. Alright, number 3, we're going to go with another band that had a big influence on Deftones music, and another band that sort of pushed Deftones to incorporate a much wider soundscape and to incorporate different elements, non-metal elements, into their music, and that would be none other than The Cure, their incredible album Disintegration. Chino, huge fan of The Cure, and I think The Cure particularly had a big influence on the kind of like romantic side of Deftones music, and really like the textures on songs like Sex Tape, Digital Bath, even stuff like Knife Party. And The Cure's influence on Deftones is not limited to just the kind of lush instrumentation that Deftones sort of incorporates. It's also Robert Smith's vocals. If you think about the kind of vocals that Chino is known for, it is both his really high-pitched screams, but also his sort of whispers that he used on Adrenaline, Around the Fur, parts of White Pony, definitely parts of the self-titled album. That seems to me like that was influenced very much by Robert Smith, who also used kind of a hushed vocal in a lot of his music. So you can hear The Cure's influence all over Deftones, and definitely a great album to check out. You could really go with any Cure album, but Disintegration is truly a classic. Alright, number 4 is going to be Nothing, Guilty of Everything, great Philadelphia shoegaze band. This is definitely a heavier shoegaze band, and it's still pretty punchy, although this isn't metal at all. They definitely have really heavy riffs, and this is a band that kind of has their backbone in heavier music. This came out on Relapse Records, which is predominantly a metal record label, and founding member Dominic Palermo came up in the hardcore band Horror Show. So there's definitely some heaviness throughout this album. There's sort of the heavy ethos here. Also, co-songwriter on this album, Brandon Setta, who was a former member of Nothing, was a big Deftones fan. So you can definitely hear some Deftones influence here. And I think Deftones fans will love this music. It's very heavy, it's very hypnotic, incredible riffs, amazing melodies, and all the great shoegaze textures that you would associate with albums like Saturday Night Wrist and Koi no Yokon. This is definitely an album that kind of brought shoegaze back to the forefront of alternative music in the 2010s. Alright, number 5, UK band Higher Power. So Higher Power are definitely more of a hardcore band than anything else, but they do have some of the kind of big, soaring sounds of some 90s alternative bands, and honestly, they sort of sound like if Jane's Addiction and Deftones had a baby, this is what would come out. So Higher Power, I think, are a really cool band. Their album 27 Miles Underwater came out a few years ago. It's a great album. I listened to this at work one day, and my coworker said, "This reminds me of Deftones," and I was like, yeah, there is something here. It's kind of hard to put your finger on exactly what it is. It's not necessarily the vocals. It's not necessarily the riffs, but there's something that's sort of reminiscent of Deftones here. So definitely an album worth checking out. Even if it doesn't remind you of Deftones, it's still a pretty sick album. So Higher Power, 27 Miles Underwater. All right, the next 5 recommendations are going to be slightly heavier for anybody who wants to kind of go in a heavier direction or wants to maybe try some heavier music if you haven't yet and you're interested. I think Deftones are kind of a great entry-level band to get you into some heavier music. So here are 5 recommendations to kind of turn it up a little bit. We'll start with the least heavy here. 1993, Typo Negative, their incredible album Bloody Kisses. I think Typo Negative had that kind of classic alternative metal sound. This is a band that was inspired by stuff like Kiss, so they had that really big, sort of like arena sound that albums like Koi no Yokan have. Also, Typo Negative, much like Deftones, are very like sexual and sort of horny, so there's some crossover there. I think fans of Deftones will love Typo Negative. Those who haven't forayed into Typo Negative's music, I think will really enjoy them. Incredible band, really important band, influential. You can go with any of their albums, but I think Bloody Kisses is a great place to start. All right, number 6, we're gonna go with Sepultura Roots, which is where an all-time classic metal band, Sepultura, kind of goes into a more nu metal direction, incorporates some of the styles of nu metal. This album came out kind of during the peak of nu metal's popularity, and there were several bands that started to incorporate styles like this. Slayer had an album where they incorporated nu metal styles, and honestly, I think Sepultura's is the best of the bands that started to sort of borrow from this genre. I think this is one of Sepultura's best albums. Sometimes I think it's unfairly criticized, but this is incredibly catchy, as all Sepultura's music is. It has such unbelievable grooves throughout. It has some really extreme vocals, and it's just got some awesome riffs. I mean, this thing is filled with incredible riffs that I think Deftones fans will love. And definitely an album to check out for fans of Deftones who have not listened to Sepultura. This is probably going to be the first album you'd want to check out. All right, number 7, we're going to go with another somewhat controversial album in its time, Deafheaven's Sunbather. This is another album like Nothing's Guilty of Everything that kind of brought shoegaze back to the forefront of the wider music scene in the 2010s. And this was actually like a big watershed moment for the black gaze genre, which is black metal and shoegaze sort of fused together. Deafheaven definitely didn't pioneer this genre. They're not the first to do this, but they are the ones that made it most popular, or at least had the biggest success with this album, Sunbather. This was like huge when it came out. I mean, there were songs here that were in an Apple Music commercial. So this album had an incredible amount of success, and because of that, it got an incredible amount of hate. It has the really intense black metal vocals, and it also has really emotional moments throughout. There's obviously these big tension building moments that release into these like triumphant epic songs. There's sick guitar solos throughout. Kerry McCoy, I think, was a really good guitarist. I think this is a great album and a very logical next step for Deftones fans because it still has the familiar shoegaze stuff, but it also is a little bit heavier with more intense vocals. So definitely an album worth checking out. All right, number 9, I'm going to recommend Converge's Jane Doe. Converge have very little in common with Deftones. This is a completely different style of music. It is much more intense, it's much more chaotic, it's much more technical. This is a band that plays an extremely intense style of metalcore. They came up as a hardcore punk band, but they always leaned more metallic hardcore. And really the reason I'm recommending this is as somebody who has always loved Deftones, who kind of first got into heavy music through Deftones, I myself had a hard time figuring out what to listen to next because I was eager to listen to heavier music, but I really wasn't into the more guttural vocal style on death metal albums that my friends would recommend me. I just wasn't into it yet. I hadn't acquired that taste yet. And it wasn't until I heard Converge's Jane Doe that I really found a vocal style that I enjoyed. And I think it's because Jacob Bannon's really high-pitched pterodactyl-like screeches were similar enough to Chino's screams that I found something that I really loved. And this became my favorite album of all time, my favorite heavy music album of all time. I think it's incredible. I think it's a great next step for people that want to get into a heavier album. If you haven't heard this, it's essential. Definitely check it out. All right, number 10 here, we're going with Full of Hell and Nothing When No Birds Sing. This is an album that came out a few years ago, and kind of like Deafheaven's Sunbather, this is an album that fuses extremely heavy music with shoegaze, but this is much different than Sunbather. It's done in a much different way. Full of Hell, one of the most renowned grindcore death metal bands of the last 10, 15 years or so. A band that gets a ton of acclaim for their collaborative work with other artists. And Nothing are, like I said before, a shoegaze band that became very celebrated for kind of bringing back shoegaze in the 2010s. This album sees them kind of fuse their two styles together in a way that's incredibly interesting. You have songs that are just super noisy, super chaotic and intense, more familiar to stuff on Full of Hell's work. You have stuff that's like straight up shoegaze, like you would hear on a Nothing album. And you have moments where they blend all of this together on the same song. This album is really cool. I have personally never heard these two styles melded together in this way before. This was my favorite album when it came out in 2022. I go back to it frequently. I think anybody who likes the shoegaze elements and wants to listen to some much heavier music than you would get on Deftones will love this album. It's definitely worth checking out. And just in general, very much an underappreciated album that didn't get the respect it deserved when it came out. So definitely check this one out, and you could explore more of Full of Hell's music if you enjoy it. So that's all I got. Thank you so much for watching. Hope you found something that you like here. Hope you enjoy some of these albums. If you're already a fan of some of these artists, let me know what you think about these picks. And if you have more suggestions, please drop them in the comments. Thank you for watching. See you next time.